Today I'd like to talk about St. Francis de Sales. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about his life. He was born in 1567 in an area of France called Savoy. Savoy is located near the Alps. Interestingly enough, both of his parents were of royal descent, and his family lived in a castle on top of a hill, which is still there till this day. St. Francis's father had big dreams of his son growing up to become either a lawyer or a politician, or maybe even what was called a senator in the French king's government. St. Francis always lived a little bit in fear of his father, but really appreciated him. But inside he just knew he didn't want to be a politician or anything of that sort, and he didn't know how to handle that. So he told his mother, who was a very gentle and soft religious woman, he told her that he wanted to become a priest, but knew that his father might not approve. So his mother told him that she would work on his father and convince him, and sure enough it worked. His father gave his blessing for St. Francis to go ahead and study to become a priest. So that's what he did. And in 1593, St. Francis was ordained as a priest. Now you have to understand that during that time, Europe was going through some very difficult times. There were a lot of issues and problems between the Catholics and the Protestants. 50 years prior to St. Francis being born, there was a German monk by the name of Martin Luther. He rebelled against the Catholic Church because he was fed up and angry with all the problems and scandals and issues that were happening in the church, even allegations of abuse. He didn't want to follow the Catholic Church. He also knew many other Catholics who felt the same way. They too were fed up and wanted to disassociate themselves with the Catholic Church. So Martin Luther started his church. He did not really agree with the teachings of the Catholic Church. And because so many other people didn't, they left and joined his church, the Protestant Church. After that, there were religious wars where Catholics killed Protestants and Protestants killed Catholics. One horrendous incident during St. Francis's time was the St. Bartholomew Massacre. And to this day, the Catholic Church still feels shame and some embarrassment about that, because there were over 3,000 Protestants that were killed by the Catholics. Well, when St. Francis became a priest, the bishop asked him to go on an extensive missionary journey and to do missionary work. At that time, there were a lot of Catholics who were joining the Protestant Church, and it was St. Francis's job on his missionary work to go out and try and bring people back to the Catholic Church. So off he set by foot and by horseback through the cold, harsh winters, having to sleep outside next to bread ovens to keep warm. Sometimes he and his people would even have to sleep up in a tree, and they would have to take ropes and tie themselves to the branches because they were afraid they would fall out and get eaten by the wolves. He traveled throughout the land and worked very hard for the church. The story says that one day St. Francis arrived in this very small town, and this town had a very small church. The Protestants used the church, but it was also used by the Catholics. They shared it. St. Francis and his people would stand outside until the Protestants were done, and then he and the Catholics would go in and have Mass. There were about 80 people that would attend church, and St. Francis would preach. However, there were very few Catholics in that crowd. Most of them were Protestants who were angry at St. Francis and would persecute and ridicule him while he was preaching. But he would just keep preaching and just be patient. He realized that his missionary work or his preaching wasn't working the way he wanted it to. So he had this idea that instead of preaching, he would start writing his message and start writing about the Catholic beliefs on pamphlets, because people wouldn't listen to what he had to say. So he would go at night and sneak through the village and put those pamphlets under people's doors. And he knew that people didn't want to listen to what he had to say, but he thought for sure that the curiosity would get to them and that they would actually start reading the pamphlets and maybe have a slight change of heart. St. Francis's idea worked. There were a lot of Protestants that wanted to talk to him in private, so he would talk to them and preach to them. And the story says that throughout St. Francis's life, he was able to bring between 60 and 80,000 people back to the Catholic Church. If you stop and think about it, that's a quite impressive number. St. Francis was so successful in doing that because he was a very patient man. He was not judgmental, harsh, or critical. He was always very gentle. You would think that that must mean growing up he was very loved and was very loving himself and sweet, but he was actually very temperamental when he was growing up. And he changed through God's grace and became a gentle, loving, and supportive person. And through that he touched so many people's lives and changed them. In 1602, when St. Francis was 35, he was ordained as a bishop, and he worked very hard traveling the land, teaching people to become strong in their Catholic faith. He also worked very hard bringing many Protestants back to the Catholic Church. One of our modern-day traditions is something that comes from St. Francis called 40 hours devotion. When the Eucharist, Jesus' body, is placed in something called a monstrance, people can then kneel and speak with Jesus. People pray for the 40 hours, and when this is over, there is a procession. St. Francis created 40 hours devotion to emphasize the Protestant people that the Eucharist is Jesus' body. And he did it not only for the Protestants, but also because there were many Catholics who really couldn't grasp this notion. 40 hours was very successful, and it helped people understand this. When St. Francis was a bishop, he always tried to make time for people when they needed him. It mattered not whether they were wealthy or poor, educated, uneducated. He met with them and encouraged them in their faith. He also wrote a book called Introduction to the Devout Life. The book focused on teaching people to live a more holy lifestyle. Back in his time, many people thought the only way for someone to be holy was if they lived the life of a priest or nun. But St. Francis didn't believe that. He believed that even a mother could be holy. Now, a mother can't pray all day and neglect her children, but she could learn about God's will, take care of her children, and pray throughout the day. And she could still be a mom. A doctor could be holy, possibly by taking care of the sick and the poor and not charging them. And he could pray at times throughout the day when he was not busy. This book became extremely popular and sold all over the land. During St. Francis's life, he had several friends that also became saints. There was St. Vincent de Paul, and he was very thankful to St. Francis for teaching him how to become a holy person. Also, another famous saint was Jane de Chantal. St. Jane de Chantal. She was married for quite some time and then widowed, and was a very solemn person. And St. Francis really encouraged her and helped her become a happier person. And she ended up establishing the or an order of nuns called the Visitadines. That order of nuns is still around to this day. St. Francis died in 1622. The Church named him the patron saint of journalists. All kinds of journalists, writers, people that wrote magazines, books, because he had written a book and had published so many papers, so they found that fitting. Also, they named him the patron saint of deaf people, and let me tell you why. When St. Francis was a bishop, he led a quite busy life, but he happened upon a homeless man who was deaf, and his name was Martin. St. Francis invited him to come live with him and become his caretaker. So he would cook and clean and take care of St. Francis's household. And when St. Francis would have guests, Martin would take care of them as well. The story says that St. Francis learned and created a lot of home signs to communicate with Martin, and the two of them developed quite an effective communication system. And St. Francis taught him about faith in the Catholic Church, gave him communion, and confirmed him. And the stories say that when St. Francis died in 1622, Martin was absolutely crushed and devastated. He really loved. St. Francis led a very fascinating life. It was interesting that during his lifetime, the Catholic Church was going through so many trials and tribulations, just like they are today. Let me give you an example. During St. Francis's time, the Catholic Church had a lot of scandals, just like we do today. During his time, there were a lot of Catholics who were fed up and left the Church and became Protestants. Today, we see mass numbers of people leaving the Catholic Church and joining other religions. During his time, there were Catholics who didn't understand the Catholic Church or their faith and were very weak in their faith. And we see that in today's church as well. St. Francis saw so many challenges, but he didn't give up. He worked hard to help people understand about God and to help them with their faith. And he was very successful. People knew that St. Francis was a holy man, meaning that he had a wonderful relationship with God, that he was very devout in prayer, and that he really understood the sacrament, gave Mass, went to confession. St. Francis knew about God, and he read the Bible a lot. He was able to talk about God and explain it to people, not in a harsh or judgmental way, but in a loving and nurturing way. And that's exactly how we need to be. The Church needs our help in encouraging people to understand God and to appreciate the Catholic Church and to understand our faith. So we need to become more holy. We need to have a deeper relationship with God. We need to pray more and appreciate the sacrament of Jesus Christ that God gives us. We do that through prayer and confession. It also means that we need ourselves to have a better understanding of our faith, a better understanding of God, and how we do that is through reading the Bible and studying the Catholic faith. And we explain that to people who may question their faith or not understand it. Just like St. Francis did, we need to be patient, loving, and kind. God bless you.